Welcome back to Thriving in Business and Life. This is Will Wilkinson.
And this is Christopher Harding. We're here in our downtown office suite, our recording setup that we have here, so traffic is sometimes part of the experience.
Yeah, we're live in beautiful downtown Ashland.
That's right. Well, you know, last week we got into story and also bias and talked about really how sometimes the role we play is as important as the job we have. In other words, I might have a job, but what's the role I see myself in as I walk into any given situation?
Right, and this can be a problem when someone gets wedded to a role and they're not as flexible as they could be, particularly when things shift around personnel-wise and everybody is expected to make a little adjustment. Somebody clinging to an old role can be a problem.
Well, and just the ability to be flexible enough to say, what does this situation require of me in order for things to turn out the way I want to, or that I hope that they will.
Yeah, the concept of just-in-time leadership is very interesting, where teams understand that in any given moment, someone may emerge as the leader. They've got the skills, they've got the awareness, and they may be the leader of the moment.
Yeah, so that you can check that episode out if you would like to. And this week, what we're really going to take a look at is in a way, it comes out of story, but it also is a lead into a further down program about vision. And this week we're going to be exploring the whole idea of values, foundational values, or core values, sometimes people call them. And we've kind of developed a little bit different take on values than sometimes is used.
Yeah, I remember when we were writing this for the book and then translating it into the online course, I was really captivated by how simple we made it. Values usually evoke kind of aspirational, philosophical ideas, and nothing wrong with that, but I loved the way, I think it was your clarification, that values really relate to what lights us up.
Yeah, I mean that's the take we've generated on this, is that values can be aspirational, and a lot of times they end up having us should ourselves. You know, right. I should be better at this, rather than asking the question, what is it that genuinely lights me up? What is the quality or characteristic that just has me feel like I'm at my most authentic best?
Yeah, and we can really confuse ourselves. I'm remembering a film years ago where some woman had been to Africa. She was a photographer, and she was complaining that all the pictures she'd taken of animals just showed a bunch of trees. And someone pointed out that she was really good at taking pictures of trees. And she said, but I wanted to take pictures of animals. He said, well, yeah, but you actually took pictures of trees, and they're beautiful. So she was confused. She thought she was supposed to do one thing. She really wanted to do something else. I think our values can be like that too. We grow up, we inherit values from our parents, from teachers, mentors, so we can mistakenly think that our values should be a certain way, but those aren't really lighting us up. So there's a constant pressure to actually do what we really want to do.
You know, it's interesting. I remember coaching a woman, and she was very just profound in her profession. She was an absolute top-notch executive. And as we were talking, she said that she had this underlying guilt about being so good in her profession because a value that she felt she had was that of family. And she felt that anything she did to take away from her role in her family as a mother and a wife was in some way cheating. Wow. And so what we talked about was, you know, first of all, where had she gotten that value? And it was something that had been instilled generationally, right? So in a way, sometimes we refer to that as a borrowed value. It's not authentically mine. I borrowed it from my community, my family, my religion, whatever it might be. And then, you know, she said, but what do I do? I mean, I'm a mother. I'm a wife. And it was, well, what is it that lights you up about your job?
Right.
Then she started to talk about things like the ability to have ideas, to lead a team, and so on. And what I suggested, I said, but what if you took that back into your family.
Exactly.
And instead of imposing whatever somebody else's idea of a mother and a wife was with a family, you brought your natural values of organization and creativity and spontaneity and all these things that make you a great leader in the business, and put those back into your family life. And you could just see both the light go on and this sense of relief that she didn't have to be in conflict anymore.
Yeah, well, that's such wise counsel, because often a person feels trapped, and they think that if they were to actually do what lights them up, they'd have to abandon their life. They literally couldn't keep on doing what they're doing, when, as you pointed out, the challenge, the opportunity, is to bring the value that genuinely lights us up into the circumstance we're in. And I don't think it's an accident we use that metaphor, lighting us up, because it is as distinct as a light switch going on. We know the feeling. We've witnessed it with other people. We get into our zone, our enjoyment zone, where we're really living a value. It is as if a light switch gets thrown and suddenly we're lit up.
Well, when we're talking with managers and leaders about their people, part of what we encourage them to do is find out what lights up each of your people, and see if you can help them figure out how to bring some of that into their different jobs or roles, especially the ones that seem to be mundane and boring.
Right.
Well, how is it that they could tune that particular part of their job up by bringing in curiosity or creativity, or even a sense of family?
Yeah, for years I've posed a question to people who are wrestling with this issue. If you weren't already doing this, would you choose to? Now, that's a dangerous question, because often people are living in cognitive dissonance, trapped between what they would like to be doing and what they find themselves doing. But lately I've revised that question. It made it a little more nuanced and a little more invitational to some kind of solution. I've said, if you weren't already doing what you're doing this way, would you choose to do it this way, or might you do it differently? Now, that's a very different slant on that question, because we need jobs. We are in the family we're in. We can't just say, well, hell no, I'm out of here. We have the situation we have. Often we've bought into the program that those circumstances are controlling us, that they are making us have the experience either resonating with our values or not, when really we have a lot of choice in every circumstance for how we deal with the circumstance, not just I'm in it or I'm out of it.
Exactly. So let's walk through just a couple of the basics of how we work with clients on values. The first one is to help them make the distinction between borrowed values, ones that they maybe picked up from society or their family.
Well, give people an example of a borrowed value.
So let's take. I think the one I did with my client was good. She had the borrowed value of family and what that meant. Now, by the time we were done, she had family still as a value, but it had taken a completely different shape. Family became, for her, a vehicle through which she could share the best parts of herself, light up the people in her life, rather than a sense of obligation.
Well, I think we can understand how words become anchors for certain understandings and behavior. So for her, family meant something.
Right.
And what it meant wasn't really fulfilling her. There's nothing wrong with family, but she needed to have her own values woven in to what that word really meant for her.
Right. It's in the last couple of episodes we talked about that we impose meaning onto things. We impose meaning onto words. So once we get clear on what our authentic values are and what truly does light us up, the next step is to make the distinction between having those authentic values that light us up and actually living them.
Yeah.
So,
there's the rub.
Well, again, a lot of times what happens, you said it well, we allow our circumstances to define, in our mind at least, whether or not we can actually live that value out.
Yeah, there's an odd paradox here, because often freedom is associated with no limitations. But that's a very adolescent view of it. I mean, one example, for me to be free to drive safely, I need to accept the limitation in this country of driving on the right side of the road. Now, if I'm in New Zealand, it's different. I'll drive on the left side of the road. That's a limitation. But the limitation allows me the freedom to drive. So this topic is very interesting because to live our values in the circumstances we're in, it's necessary to acknowledge and accept the limitations that are inherent there, but not as something that can prevent us from having a wonderful experience. They're just practicalities.
Well, my dad, who was an artist, said that creativity was at its best when faced with limitations.
There you go.
And so I think when we take a look at values, and I was talking about managers becoming familiar with what lights their people up, this is the third part of the equation. So am I living my values or borrowed values?
Right.
Am I now actually living my authentic values, or are they merely professed values? And the third piece is, can I learn how, and the answer is yes, to infuse my authentic values into everything I do?
Well, now this is the big one, and this is so exciting because it introduces us to just how proactive we can be. And in our culture, where so much is handed to us, given to us, imposed on us, it's created in a lot of people the sense of powerlessness. And what we're saying is that no, we have a tremendous amount of power in our circumstances to be proactive about what we experience.
Right. So, if we take that to everyday level, one that we've both used with clients in coaching, for example, is, let's say somebody has a difficult relationship with somebody in their work environment. And every time they have to work with that person, to them it feels like drudgery, And so the question is, well, okay, that's the story you've created up till now. You've probably even generated a nice bias about it as well. Now let's change. Let's say we want to create a different quality of experience with that person. What value, which of your authentic values could you bring into your interactions with that person that would help change your experience and probably theirs?
Now, see, what's interesting about that, as you say it so clearly, is it's not really a reaction.
No,
it's a
very
choice.
Proactive, yeah.
You're being proactive to introduce something that may be quite novel.
Right, and a lot of times, we've got to be willing to experiment. So, for example, with one client I was thinking of, her boss, who was also my client, was somebody who was fairly regimented and wasn't necessarily open to a lot of change. And for her, curiosity and wondering what if was one of the things that lit her up. So she started to try to bring that into her conversations with her boss and found him being somewhat annoyed by it, which made her even more frustrated. So
I can picture it.
Right. So then it was, okay, well, this is great. Now it's even a greater challenge. How are we going to allow you to smuggle curiosity into your conversations with your boss? And this is how she figured it out. She's a very bright woman. She said, I know what I need to do. Rather than me asking what if, I need to ask him questions like, well, what do you think about this? What do you think would happen if
and
we
did
did
it work?
that? Oh, it did, because then he got to be creative and feel like he was still in charge.
Well, this is a really close parallel to an experience I had, years and years ago, working with someone who was pretty rigid, and I'm pretty imaginative, and our conversations would be difficult. I'd show up with, curiosity and imagination, and Dave would be kind of stodgy, and then we'd debate, argue, and since he was in charge, usually I'd lose. I got tired of this, so we actually attended a weekend workshop where we learned about people's personality types, and I started to understand the differences between us. And I did something quite similar to what this woman did. I realized that I had been showing up in those conversations wishing Dave was more like me, but not giving him a chance. So I changed direction 180 degrees, and normally I would have showed up to Dave, I've got this great idea, you're going to love it, it's terrific, and then he would get resistant. Instead, I'd show up and I'd say, well, something's come up. I'm not sure there's anything to it at all, And David said, well, what is it? I'd say, well, I don't know if it's even worth mentioning. He'd say, well, yeah, what is it? What's going on? And I tell him in very guarded tones, like reserved and hesitant. And then Dave would say, well, I don't know, that sounds kind of interesting. And he would begin to bring in curiosity and imagination.
He would champion the cause.
He championed the cause, and we ended up having great conversations.
That was very clever of you.
Well, it worked. We both enjoyed it more. Now, you could say that was manipulation. I was very conscious about it, but I didn't have anything nefarious in mind. I was just, trying to find a way that we could enjoy our dialogues more.
Well, you became the voice of resistance for him, which freed him up to be able to take on the voice of curiosity and investigation.
Right.
And I think a lot of times we were talking about fixed roles. If I feel like I'm always the one who has to present the novel idea, what I may not realize is I'm robbing other people of the opportunity.
Well, that's what I was doing. I realized that.
Then we demonize them for their resistance.
Yeah, I was actually being selfish and then judging him.
Yeah. So as we think about this, just think about different circumstances you have, whether it's somebody you work with, maybe it's different meetings you have to attend. And you were talking about being proactive. So it's just kind of a fun game, if you will, because we like to kind of gamify this whole process because it makes it more entertaining and more fun to do, is to just say, what's a value I could bring to this situation I'm about to walk into? It's really like a 15-second process at the most. I'm going to, and you know this one because we've done this before, I'm going to smuggle love into the corporate boardroom today.
Right.
I'm going to infuse, creativity into this normally stodgy conversation, and just kind of start to play with it and see how adept we can get at infusing our values into different situations in a way that actually enlivens and benefits everybody involved.
Well, the scope of possibility here is truly unlimited. I'm recalling a favorite memory of mine from many years ago, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, at least, Chris, of taking a trip up in Canada, up into the Caribou, and arriving at my destination. I was giving a little presentation, and I began by saying, I really had an amazing trip coming up here. I arrived in a chauffeur-driven limousine. It was pretty luxurious, and there was actually a bathroom on board, and I was able to watch a movie. And people were, really? What kind of vehicle is this? And I said, I came up on a Greyhound bus. And people were just stunned because, at least back then up there, Greyhound buses had a bit of a stigma.
They still do, yeah.
And my attitude was, well, I'm, going to be on this bus for 4 hours. Why don't I turn it into a luxury trip? And so the value I brought in was appreciation for being taken care of.
That's great.
And I still remember the looks on people's faces. They just went, was this guy nuts or what? And then they got it, that I owned that situation. I did not accept the limitations as being something less than what I would have wanted. It was the ideal way for me to go up there. And we drove through a blizzard, and I was delighted that I wasn't behind the wheel.
Well, again, we've talked about imposing meaning. So you start to see how these things are lining up. We create stories all the time, so why not be intentional about it? Be aware that biases sneak into our stories and sometimes infect the way we see things. So let's be aware of that, and then let's intentionally start to infuse our values into situations. For you, that was appreciation. I'm reflecting back on this manager and his direct report that I was coaching both of them. And one of the other things that we did, we talked about with her was, how could she use curiosity in terms of dealing with his stodginess or resistance, as she saw it. And so what I said to her was, just asking questions about her value. I said, well, if you were to infuse curiosity into him being resistant, what would that look like?
What a great question.
And so what happened is she started to ask him a lot of questions about why he was resistant, and she wanted to understand it better, and what could she learn from him about this. And through just asking questions and being open and interested, what she found is that he many times would overcome his own objections as he thought about it out loud.
Yeah.
And then, started to become much more fluid in terms of how they could solve problems together.
Well, that's a great outcome. I have one that wasn't so great. Last year I had to fire a client. We don't do that very often, but in this case I was working with someone who was so wedded to the past. They were so overwhelmed with the burden of history and all the stories they had about people who'd done them wrong and circumstances that hadn't worked out, that try as I may, I found it very difficult to help this individual pry themselves loose from the judgments that were really tormenting them. And my every effort to encourage a sense of curiosity and looking at things from different angle was really met by a very stubborn resistance. No, that's the way it is. That guy's just a jerk. He's always been a jerk, and if he has half a chance, he's going to, hurt me again. And the attitude was like arms folded. I'm not open to anything. And try as I may, I couldn't really break through that. So in the end, I said, I'm not really sure I can help you anymore. And we went our separate ways.
Well, it's interesting because I think when we've had traumatic experiences, part of our self-protection mechanism is to hang on to a story about someone. And sometimes that may be appropriate. We might not be willing to risk with that particular person because we've been burned enough. But the question is, how do we let that bleed into the rest of our life?
Exactly,
right?
Which is what it was doing for this fellow, and he was chronically unhappy, which told me that the story he was telling wasn't working. Why not tell a new story?
Well, and this is, I had early on in my own process of learning a lot of this, one of my early mentors who was coaching me asked me a really great question very early on in our relationship, where I was dealing with a difficult boss and I was on probation for insubordination and so on. And he said to me in the process of coaching me, well, that's how it's run up till now. Are you ready and willing to create a different outcome? Now, I said yes, and he said, are you sure?
Sounds like the voice of experience.
Yeah, he was basically saying, you seem to be pretty invested in this turning out the way it is. Are you ready and willing? Now, as it turned out, I was, and I went through the challenges of eventually being able to work through that relationship and turned out dramatically improved, largely because I stopped running the story I was running. But I think sometimes, in our role, whether it be as a leader, a manager, a coach, a parent, whatever it might be, the question is, asking the person we're attempting to assist, are you ready and willing to make that change? So we talk about values, for sometimes a value comes out of a challenging situation.
Right.
A value might be, I'm going to protect myself at all expense.
Yeah. Well, the classic story is, of the saber-toothed tiger.
Right.
It's a little outdated, but, you get scared at some point in your distant past. The adrenaline kicks in, you react, you run. Well, 40 years later, you may get triggered by something that isn't nearly as severe, but you've got all that armoring, all that history, and so your reaction is just as severe.
Absolutely, and the ability, gratefully we're not therapists, so we don't a lot of times have to try and unwind that for people, but our whole approach is, from this point forward, what is it that you can and are willing to do? And if you're willing to play with this, and this is I think a vital part of it is are we willing to play with and experiment with some of these different approaches? Because if we give ourselves permission to play with it, that means it might not work sometimes, it might backfire, and if we can hold it lightly, that helps.
Well, I think of it sometimes in film terms. Both you and I have some experience in that field, where we have segues, where a scene gradually transitions into another scene, And we have jump cuts where, boom, you're suddenly in a different city, different time zone, different people. It's as radical a change as you can imagine. Well, it's the same thing. It's just one frame of film after another. I think sometimes we're addicted to these lengthy segues in our lives instead of just saying, no, right now I'm making a change, boom, that's it.
Jump cut.
Jump cut.
Yeah, that's we could use that as another term.
Yeah.
You're ready to make a jump cut,
Yeah, because the thing is, people are not happy in that old state, and they've imagined that to get out of it is going to take some kind of lengthy process. It's like Bob Newhart's 5-minute therapy for people where they explain what's wrong, and then he looks at them and he says, stop it.
Right.
Now, stop it.
Well, and there's another aspect of values I think that's important, and that is for us to really be able to get a read whether the values I think I'm infusing into a situation are actually being felt by the people that I'm working with.
So how do you do that?
Well, so part of it is to ask for feedback,
yeah,
right? To really be able to check in and see how was that for you. I think most of us, myself included, have gone through certain portions of life thinking we were doing a fantastic job infusing certain values, only to find out years later that the people we were intending to have that experience with, we're having a different experience.
Well, I had this occur the other day. I was doing a thriving mentoring session with a young woman. She's 18. And we finished what seemed to me to be a good session. And we were kind of checking out. And I said, how was my coaching? How did that work? And she said, it was great. Really enjoyed this, that, and the other. And she said, but one part of it where you were asking questions, I didn't really feel connected to. And she gave me some feedback. She was pleasant about it. But my intention hadn't delivered the communication that I hoped it would. And just me asking for her feedback and her being willing to give it to me, I found was immensely helpful. And that's improving my work with people.
Yeah.
Would not have happened if I hadn't have asked.
Well, and so the willingness to be conscious of asking, to check in, to not assume we're doing things as swimmingly as we think we are, is one thing. And then the ability to sometimes, as you did, and I'm learning to do, is to receive that tough feedback graciously, and be able to just really listen to it and go back and say, wow.
Well, this gets back to our whole conversation here, really, and a value that I think could all productively adopt is to be a learner. What can I learn from this situation?
Well, it's helpful if we can adopt that value and that mindset, right? Because that's what turns what could be failures, if we just stop right there, and turns it into, as you're suggesting, a powerful learning opportunity.
Right, because otherwise we get defensive. If I assume that I have nothing to learn, right, I'm an expert, I'm now in a defensive posture. Because I'm going to be defending my perfection, whereas if I'm a learner, I'm like, I'm always going to have something more to learn.
I think sometimes, too, it might come out of a sense of perfectionism or an overinflated sense of self, which I think we're all prone to at times. It could also come out of a sense that I'm so concerned that I'm not doing well enough that when somebody offers critical advice, I allow it to demean myself rather than saying, I'm a learner, and of course I have more to learn. This is great feedback. This will help me become even better.
Well, I think it's across the board that truly successful people will identify that they were willing to fail. They were willing to make mistakes, and they did make mistakes. They learned from them, and they went on to succeed. And just because they've succeeded doesn't mean that they won't fail again.
Right. And so, in kind of wrapping up what we're talking about here, just the invitation is to really ask yourself what lights you up, and then start to look at how can you infuse that type of characteristic or quality into more experiences during this coming week.
Well, as usual, the 30 minutes have flown by. I hope you've enjoyed it. We'll talk to you again next week. This is Will Wilkinson in Thriving in Business and Life.
And this is Christopher Harding, and you can reach us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com.